In today's video, I'm going to be making a case for why I think still life is perhaps the most relevant subject, and I'm going to paint a Kewpie doll all the while. So I will start out by saying I am painting with acrylic first. There will be a transition where I switch over to oil. I will announce that in this video. So I recently published my first book. It's called Modern Still Life from Fruit Bowls to Disco Balls. And the idea behind the book is it's instructional, but it's also a lot of my thoughts on painting in general, art making. But I have part of a chapter that I dedicated to why still life, which was incredibly important, as in order to even get this book off the ground, I had to make multiple pleas to people within the publishing house as to why still life was relevant. So there's this idea in the Western canon of art and art history that there's a hierarchy of most important subject matter. That's going to be things like religious paintings, and followed by portraits, which depict the human form. And then you have sort of genre paintings and still life kind of towards the bottom. The history is really fascinating, but I will jump straight towards right now, which is that still life is often viewed as a student learning material and really not much more. And it's funny because in the beginning of my career, when I started doing still lifes in early 2017, I remember getting some negative feedback about both the mixture of nostalgic art as well as painting still life, and the few instances that I was allowed feedback as to why my work didn't get in somewhere. And I thought this was really interesting. I've since seen the tides shift, at least on social media. It's become a lot more popular of a medium, and there's become a growing, I think, fan base for it. Not to say that no one liked still life before 2017, but to say that a lot of younger people, especially a lot of young women who grew up probably in a similar age to me, grew up experiencing a lot of love for objects. You know, we are a consumerist culture, for good or for bad. I think what's interesting about my still lifes is that it often elicits people reacting to, some version of, oh, I recognize, I identify what you're saying with still life, or like, this is what's wrong with the world because there's so much junk in the world. Okay, I'm switching to oils now. And I think that's really interesting because consumerism does get quite a bit of a blame for things. But I think as an artist, our job is less to be proper activists in the sense that we have a full plan for what needs to be done to solve the world. I always think of artists as more part of an ecosystem. And sometimes what artists do is just simply visualize, edit, distill, break down the world around them. And for me, it was finding objects at thrift stores from my childhood, arranging them carefully, and then painting these and elevating them into acrylic and oil paintings. So cut to, a little over a year ago when I was really making a case for the publisher for this book. And they wanted to know if I would be open to different subject matter. And I remember really pushing for still life because of course, I do think it's a great subject matter for learning how to paint, but also I've always been a little defensive of still life. I've been pushing back on this narrative. The funny thing is, in online spaces, or at least my corner of the art internet, still life has become pretty popular, but it was interesting to see that this publishing house really struggled with the idea of how are we going to get people to buy something so boring. And so if I might make a case for why I think still life is incredibly relevant, I think look no further than anytime you drive down the highway and see multiple storage facilities. I think that even you can point to the fact that someone who's sort of rejecting consumerism has their own identity because it's such a affront to the norm of sort of accumulating a lot of stuff. I think even people who wouldn't identify as consumeristic or greedy, you just accumulate a lot of stuff in this culture. We live in a system where the solution to most of our problems is something we can consume our way out of, or at least that's what we're told. And, to not participate in that is radical. You're called a minimalist. I also think a lot about marketing. People who even don't have art degrees, but have just watched TV or social media or have been online, that you're exposed to a lot of visual media. All things considered, most of us have a wide database of objects. You can arrange, a certain brand of gum with a certain kind of soda and a couple of toys and some makeup, and you can paint a perfect picture of somebody and really know a lot about them, their age, their class, their gender. And, a lot of that is because in marketing, whenever you make an object, a product, you then go and identify who the target audience is. And it's down to the spirit of the person. And does it always perfectly fit? No, of course not. But what I think is really interesting is that ad campaigns are created around the identity of this person. And so we have this really, really close relationship with objects and who they represent as people, because a lot of money, a lot of the economy is dedicated to driving those narratives so that we consume more. An aspect of my artistry and me as a person is to understand that I grew up below the poverty line. I grew up with people who enjoyed art, who played music, who liked studying science. My parents were not formally educated. They both dropped out of high school, got pregnant incredibly young. And yet I remember as a kid always feeling like the visual art world, specifically the fine art world, was such an affront to their sensibilities. What I mean by that is, that my mom was always appalled that people would pay so much money for art, and she would make her own, art. And of course she'd never call it art. This idea that even the term to be an artist is sort of like anointed by somebody else who sort of identifies your supreme talent or intellect and bestows upon you this title. Growing up, it just felt like the art world was really not meant for people like us. Certainly not, people who grew up below the poverty line in the Ozarks. We just felt very far out of it. So when I got a running scholarship and I was in these art classes, learning kind of visual media literacy and how to make and create and think about art and how to, deal with art, I remember thinking that as much as this world was open to me and I really enjoyed it, and I enjoyed and appreciated this education, that whenever I would make art, that I would, to the best of my ability, and I'm not saying every artist has to do this, but given my background, always try to have a level of my artwork be something that the regular everyday person can contend with and glean something from. Now, I suppose there's a case that all art should be accessible to all people, but in reality, we know that a lot of art is made with the intention of being incredibly insular and really having sort of what I consider like inside jokes, more or less, within people who are in the know, and there's sort of an enjoyment of keeping the everyday man and certainly the lower rungs of society out. I've always detested that. And getting back to my point around still life, because all of us, whether we've been formally trained in how to see the world through the lens of an artist or not, and we've never been taught to think critically, regardless, we all do have a wide database of visual, vocabulary. When you look at a Kewpie doll, you've seen them in thrift stores. They mean something to you. You might know that Rose O'Neal made them. You might know that they're tied to suffrage, or you could just see them as cute baby. And I think when you arrange it in a still life, you can create a context where it might mean something. You can put a lot of imagery of womanhood and domesticity around with little babies, and all of a sudden the babies might be commentary on reproduction. And it doesn't mean that everyone's always going to get every layer of your art, but there's something about recognizable objects that invites in the everyday person who I think more than ever needs art to contend with in this day and age. One of my favorite thought exercises when it comes to my art is I like to imagine a world where, call it heaven, call it the great beyond, nirvana, whatever you want to call it. All of the people who have ever lived on this planet are all in one room. And I like to think that the people I would enjoy the most would be people who've lived on this planet around the same time I have and could recognize the objects I'm making art about. If you showed half of the things in my still life paintings, yard flamingos, tchotchkes, toys, video game controllers, to someone who's from like 1700s, colonial America, it would mean nothing to them. And I think the fact that it holds so much context and maybe even personal history means a lot to me as an artist. And so anytime I craft a still life with multiple objects kind of interacting with each other, I think of it like in its own a precious craft. And then the act of painting says, no, this is fine art. Even if not everyone agrees with that, that's certainly my intention. And I think it's for all of those reasons that I will always fight for still life. Again, I think it's becoming a little more accepted as a true high art form. And with this book, it was really fun to sort of express that. So I hope you enjoyed watching this. Stay tuned for more videos and feel free to subscribe.